By the spring of 1918, the Great War had entered its endgame. A palpable sense of finality hung in the air, thick as the smoke over the battlefields. For Germany, the collapse of the Russian front following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a monumental strategic gift. Nearly 1 million soldiers, freed from the east, were now flooding the Western Front. This was their last, best chance to deliver a knockout blow before the full, inexorable weight of America could tip the scales for good. The Allies, meanwhile, were on the ropes. France was still reeling from the army-wide mutinies of 1917. Its manpower bled white. Britain, battered by the horrific losses at Passchendaele, was stretched to its breaking point. But across the Atlantic, a new army was gathering strength. The Americans were coming. This year would not be another slow grind of attrition. It would be a brutal, desperate sprint to the finish line. A final gamble played out across a war-weary landscape, and the outcome would be shaped as much by a hidden, microscopic killer as by the grand plans of generals. The German Spring Offensive, codenamed Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, was unleashed on March 21, 1918. It began with Operation Michael, a hurricane of fire and steel aimed at the British Fifth Army. This was not the predictable, wave-after-wave frontal assault of years past. This was something new, something terrifyingly effective. Stormtrooper tactics. Instead of massed infantry charges, small, highly trained and heavily armed groups of elite soldiers would exploit the morning fog and the chaos of the bombardment. Their mission was to infiltrate weak points in the Allied lines, bypass heavily defended strongholds, and race deep into the rear echelons to sever communication lines, attack command posts, and spread panic. They were the tip of the spear, designed to create chaos and paralysis, allowing larger infantry formations to follow and mop up the disorganized defenders. For a breathtaking moment, it worked beyond Germany's wildest dreams. The front line, a static scar of trenches for nearly 4 years, shattered and began to move. The British Fifth Army was effectively broken, its soldiers in a desperate retreat. French forces, rushed in to plug the gap, also reeled under the immense pressure. The Germans advanced up to 40 miles in some areas, a staggering distance in the context of the Western Front. It was the most significant territorial gain by either side since the opening salvos of 1914. The spires of Amiens, a crucial railway hub, were in their sights, and for a terrifying few weeks, it seemed Paris itself might fall. The psychological impact was immense, amplified by the monstrous Paris gun, a long-range artillery piece that shelled the French capital from 75 miles away, proving that nowhere was truly safe. But these spectacular advances created their own crippling problems. The very speed of the stormtroopers became their undoing. They outran their supply lines, their artillery, and their reinforcements. The German logistical system, strained by years of war and blockade, simply couldn't keep up. The elite troops were physically and mentally exhausted, their momentum faltering. And then, in captured Allied supply dumps, they found something far more potent and demoralizing than any weapon: abundance. After years of the Allied naval blockade and the infamous turnip winter back home, where the German population starved on meager rations, the sight of Allied plenty was a devastating psychological blow. They found crates overflowing with coffee, white bread, butter, jam, and tins of high-quality meat. For soldiers who had been surviving on black bread and thin soup, it was a stark, undeniable revelation of their enemy's vast material wealth and industrial might. The war, they realized, wasn't just being fought on the battlefield, but in the factories and farms far behind the lines. And they were losing. This contrast between their own deprivation and the enemy's riches crushed morale. There's a darkly funny, almost surreal story from this period that perfectly captures the moment. A German unit, advancing through the chaos, reportedly stumbled upon a British field kitchen where the cooks were still busy serving hot stew. In the confusion of the retreat, the cooks, perhaps out of sheer habit or shock, just kept serving. For a few bizarre minutes, the German attackers and the British cooks found themselves in an absurd truce, with enemy soldiers lining up to be served a hot meal from the same pots. It was a fleeting human moment of shared absurdity in the midst of total war. A brief pause before the grim reality of their situation set back in. Ultimately, the spring offensive stalled. It had punched a huge bulge, a salient, into the Allied line, but it failed to achieve a decisive war-winning breakthrough. The German army had exhausted its best men and finest resources in the gamble, leaving them overextended and vulnerable. And just as their strength began to wane, a new, hidden enemy attacked both sides with chilling impartiality: the Spanish flu. This virulent strain of influenza, misnamed because neutral Spain was the first country to report on it freely, swept through the cramped trenches, crowded troopships, and congested cities of the world. It was a biological catastrophe on a global scale, a pandemic that would ultimately claim more lives than the war itself. The flu was particularly devastating to the armies. It struck the young and healthy, the very demographic that filled the ranks. Men would report sick with a fever at dawn and be dead by nightfall, their lungs filled with fluid. Field hospitals were completely overwhelmed, turning into charnel houses. The pandemic's second wave in the autumn of 1918 was far deadlier than the first, killing more soldiers and civilians than machine guns or poison gas. While it hit the Allies hard, it was catastrophic for the Central Powers. The German army, already malnourished and exhausted, had far less resistance to the disease. It was a biological shadow war, a silent, invisible killer that sapped the strength of every army at the most critical moment of the entire conflict. With the German advance spent and their armies weakened by influenza and exhaustion, the strategic initiative shifted. The crisis of the spring offensive had forced the Allies to finally do what they should have done years earlier: unify their command structure. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch was appointed as the supreme Allied commander, able to coordinate the British, French, and newly arriving American armies as a single cohesive force. As the German gamble failed, Foch prepared to strike back. This counterattack would become known as the 100 Days Offensive. It was not just another battle, but a relentless rolling series of coordinated assaults along the entire front. Historians note this is the moment where all the painful lessons of 4 years of war finally coalesced into a winning formula. It was no longer just about infantry going over the top. This was the dawn of modern combined arms warfare. Artillery, now master of its craft, fired incredibly precise, creeping barrages that moved just ahead of the advancing infantry, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. Tanks, once clumsy and unreliable, were now deployed in massed formations, their improved Mark V models capable of clearing barbed wire and machine gun nests. Above, aircraft dominated the sky, no longer just scouts, but active participants in the battle, spotting for the guns, strafing trenches, and bombing supply lines. But the truly revolutionary, life-saving link in this chain was communication. Portable field radios and telephones were becoming more common. For the first time, forward observers in captured trenches or pilots circling overhead could communicate artillery adjustments in near real time, directing fire with unprecedented accuracy. This dynamic coordination could break German counterattacks before they even formed. The constant crackle of radio chatter in command posts became the symphony of a new, mobile, and deadly form of battle. The Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918, was the thunderclap that signaled the beginning of the end. A massive surprise attack led by British, Australian, and Canadian forces, spearheaded by over 500 tanks and supported by nearly 2,000 aircraft, completely shattered the German lines. The coordination was flawless, the shock total. An Australian signaller on the ground described the terrifying spectacle as a mechanized nightmare for the enemy. The psychological impact on the German high command was even greater. General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's chief strategist, famously called it the Black Day of the German army. It wasn't the amount of territory lost, but the manner of the defeat. Entire German divisions had simply collapsed, surrendering in droves. The morale of the German soldier, facing this unstoppable, coordinated storm of steel, finally and irrevocably fractured. As the Allies pushed relentlessly forward during the 100 Days, the Central Powers crumbled from within. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary all sued for peace, leaving Germany utterly alone. Back in Germany, the home front, starved and exhausted, finally broke. In late October, sailors of the High Seas Fleet at Kiel mutinied, refusing a suicidal final sortie against the Royal Navy. This act of defiance sparked a nationwide revolution. Workers' and soldiers' councils, inspired by the Russian Soviets, sprang up in cities across the country. Faced with military collapse on the front and full-blown revolution at home, the German High Command knew the war was lost. They informed the Kaiser that they could no longer guarantee his safety, forcing him to abdicate and flee to the Netherlands. The generals, who had wielded near-dictatorial power, now desperately sought an armistice, a ceasefire, to prevent a complete disintegration of the army and the nation. The frantic negotiations were conducted via telegraph and radio, with messages flashing across the front lines. The final terms laid down by the Allies were harsh. Germany had to withdraw from all occupied territory, surrender its fleet, and hand over vast quantities of guns, machines, and railway stock, ensuring it could not resume the fight. And so, we arrive at the most famous deadline in modern history, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. At 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The ceasefire was set to take effect 6 hours later, at 11 a.m. Paris time. Along the hundreds of miles of front, the news spread by every means available, by telephone, by radio operator, by runners dashing from post to post. In the final, tragic hours, fighting continued, with some commanders senselessly ordering attacks to capture one last piece of ground, costing thousands of lives. Then, as clocks struck 11, the unimaginable happened. The ceaseless, deafening roar of the guns, the soundtrack of life and death for 4.5 years, simply stopped. An eerie, profound, and almost frightening silence fell across the Western Front. For the soldiers in the trenches, the initial reaction was not celebration, but a stunned, numb disbelief. Was it a trick? A temporary lull? Then, as the silence held, it slowly sank in. It was over. Quiet, overwhelming relief washed over them. There are countless accounts of men cautiously climbing out of their trenches and walking into the cratered wasteland of no man's land, not to fight, but simply to look, to see the faces of the men they had been trying to kill just minutes before. Some exchanged souvenirs, a button, a cigarette, a photograph. Others just sat down on the lip of a shell hole and cried, releasing the pent-up fear, grief, and exhaustion of years. A British telephonist, stationed deep in a dugout, later recalled the moment the guns ceased. He said the silence was so absolute, so heavy, it was physically uncomfortable. A painful ringing in the ears after years of being conditioned to a constant, earth-shaking barrage of noise. The war to end all wars was finally over. But the world it left behind was a ghost of its former self. Entire empires had vanished. A generation of young men was decimated. The physical landscape of Europe was shattered and scarred, and its political and psychological landscape was even more profoundly damaged. The final deadly moments of the conflict had passed, but they left behind a legacy of trauma, bitterness, and unresolved questions that would haunt the decades to come and pave the way for an even greater catastrophe. As we reflect on the tumultuous events of 1918, what do you believe was the most decisive factor in the final collapse? The failure of the Spring Offensive, the Allied combined arms tactics, or the internal social and political breakdown within the Central Powers? Share your thoughts below.